folks, I'm just going to familiarize you all with our lovely panelists, and then we'll dive in with the first question. So on the my far right here is Donnie Maclurcan. He is the director of the Post-Growth Institute, and he's a facilitator, author, and social entrepreneur, and passionate about all things not-for-profit. Originally from Australia, Donnie spent the past decade in the US before moving to Argentina in 2022, from where he coordinates the Post-Growth Institute. He has worked in Egypt, Kenya, Fiji, Thailand, and South Korea, helping over 500 nonprofit projects start, scale, and sustain their work, while his own initiatives include developing the Offers and Needs Market, Free Money Day, the Post-Growth Alliance, the Enriched List, the Not-for-Profit Way Training, Silent Skype Team Meetings, Project Australia, and the globally used Post-Growth hashtag. An affiliate professor of economics at Southern Oregon University and fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, Donnie holds a PhD in social science. He is working on his fourth book, How on Earth Our Future is Not for Profit. Next to Donnie, we have Dr. Justine Huxley. She is the co-founder of Kincentric Leadership, whose vision is for a future in which everyone knows we are part of a living, intelligent Earth. Kincentric Leadership convenes a global community of leaders stretching from Hawaii to Japan, who are co-researchers into the question, what will leadership look like if we act from within the wider web of life? Justine was part of the team at St Ethelburga Center for over 18 years. She has a PhD in the psychology of gambling addiction, and in a previous life worked in derivative sales for a global investment bank. Two life chapters that are not unrelated. Her first job, usefully, involved working with camels and horses on a Danish island. Author of Generation Y, Spirituality and Social Change, she is publishing a second book later this year on facilitating interspecies community. Justine belongs to a Sufi tradition which, over the last 2 decades, has embedded its teachings within a framework of spiritual and ecological renewal. She has led meditation and dreamwork groups within the tradition for many years. Justine has a particular interest in how human beings can learn to wayfind through the polycrisis, uncovering a deeper relationship with instinct and making decisions in relationship with the wider web of life. Also, Justine, deep gratitude to you for being here and being part of this panel, especially after Tequila couldn't be here, and making the wisdom of concentric leadership be a part of this puzzle. So thank you so much to you. And next to Justine, we have Dr. Alemayehu Wassie Eshete. He has over 3 decades of forestry, ecology, and conservation experience from within government offices and NGOs. He joined ORDA as a forest development project coordinator and was steadily promoted up to executive director. So ORDA is the Organization for Rehabilitation and Development in Amhara. The organization protects and restores forests in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, the origin of most of the Nile's water. They do this by conserving high biodiversity church forests, small but fertile ancient oases that surround 30,000 churches dotted across the region. They build walls around these forests to protect them from free local communities and collect seeds from them to plant natural buffers. Working with local communities, they then expand corridors between the church forests to connect them and restore more of the natural landscape. Alemayehu holds several degrees in forestry and forest ecology, including a master's and a PhD. He is also the author of best-selling mystical novels in Ethiopia. And then next to me, we have Mary Harrington. Mary is the author of Feminism Against Progress. She writes twice weekly for the publication UnHerd and is also a contributing editor with them. Mary's been a janitor, a communard, a marketing executive, an internet founder, and a psychotherapist, among many other things. Her work has appeared in the London Times, the Mail on Sunday, the New Statesman, the New York Post, and the Spectator, among many others. Would you please join me in warmly welcoming all of our panelists? I really am very glad that you're here and have been following all four of your work, and all four of you are individuals who live the courage of their convictions. So the first question, simple one, to dive in with our theme of navigating degrowth, diverse perspectives. That is the title, but really we're going to be navigating degrowth as much as we will be grappling with what we're trying to figure out at this very juncture in our civilizational life story through the lens of spiritual ecology, through what we have soaked in all throughout the course of this day. So first question, if you can just tell me in a couple of lines each, what is your definition or understanding of degrowth? And degrowth is not exactly a synonym for transition, but many experts also say that what's behind it is just that impetus to serve transition. So you're welcome to speak more to the transition angle or just what your understanding is of degrowth. Shall we start with Alemayehu? Shall we start with you?
I came from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to participate with this conference, and I really thank you very much. When the term comes to my mind, the term degrowth, in a nutshell, it is very scary. Because when you see from the Western world, you guys, you had enough growth. You guys, you had enough development. So it's good to stop and refine the humanity, the morality. But when you come to developing countries like Ethiopia, still we need growth. We have so many people, food insufficient. Still we have poor infrastructure. So from our perspective, growth may be necessary. But the understanding the concept degrowth is we have a broken relationship, I think. In my organization, ORDA, the motive we have is to fix this broken relationship. And when I say broken relationship, it's in 4 levels. One is individuals would have a broken relationship with oneself. I could have, a broken relation with myself, within myself, and the dissatisfaction, lack of happiness, all that comes from, when you are not in a good spirit with yourself. The second level is you could have also a broken relation with people, with your neighbors, with your community. And that will be also a problem. And the third is, what we strive is people would have a broken relation with nature also. They abuse nature, they destroy their environment, especially in Ethiopia. Before 40 years, I'm a forest ecologist, I know that some studies showed before 100 years, Ethiopia would have 40% of its land mass covered by forest. But now we have less than 4%.
Alemayehu, thank you.
Yeah.
The broken relationships observation is very poignant.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to this. Thank you for sharing what your understanding is of degrowth.
Yeah, so I'm coming to that.
But just brief, sorry.
Yeah.
We will dive into it more
Okay.
deeply in just a moment.
So the fourth is with God. So degrowth is fixing all this broken relationship. That is a concept I have. In that sense, I can take the word degrowth. I mean, let's stop and fix our broken relationship. That is the point I want to build. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary, would you like to go next?
Is this on? It's on. Good. I'm going to give three alternative definitions of degrowth. There's the official one, which is a policymaker's one, I suppose, which says that There are a number of possible policies that we could apply that will perhaps require global coordination, that will perhaps require interventions from economists, from think tanks, from NGOs, from wherever, to steer us away from a global economy that's predicated on never-ending growth, which it ought to be obvious anyway, that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. That ought to be obvious by now. So that's the policymaker's definition. Then there's the definition that might be employed by the people on the receiving end of that, the little guy, if you like, who might respond to policies designed to bring about degrowth and say, you're taking away our standard of living. Or if they live in a developing country, in a developed world country, or alternatively, if they live in a developing world country, they might say, well, you're taking away our opportunity to improve our standard of living, and actually we need infrastructure. We need, we've got people living below the breadline, so what are you doing? I would propose my definition, to get there, finally, my reading of degrowth is that it's something which will happen whether we want it to or not, because our extractive relation to the planet is self-limiting and will, through its own logic, by one route or another, come to an end. And I think degrowth is an experience we're already having, broadly, certainly in outside the wealthiest parts of the developed world. It's already a reality. And degrowth is really just the experience of that extractive relationship reaching diminishing returns. So there's a sense of scraping the barrel, and of the barrel now being pretty much empty, and of that sense of emptiness moving further and further up the socioeconomic food chain.
Thank you, Mary. Justine?
I actually brought a quote with me to try and help me make the bridge between the language of degrowth, which is not one I really sit within, to the world of kinship, which is how I work. So it's from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and it's called, who was the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, who some of you may know, and it's called The Honourable Harvest. So this really says it for me. She says, know the ways of the ones who take care of you, so that you may take care of them. Introduce yourself. Be accountable as the one who comes asking for life. Ask permission before taking. Abide by the answer. Never take the first, never take the last. Take only that which you need. Take only that which is given. Never take more than half. Leave some for others. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm. Use it respectfully. Never waste what you've taken. Share. Give thanks for what you've been given. Give a gift in reciprocity for what you've taken. Sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever.
Thank you. And Donnie?
My answer to the question of what is degrowth is that I believe that in all our bodies, we actually have the answer ourselves. And I want to test that thesis. And I've been given permission to do this experiment here with you all. For this, you'll need a piece of paper and a pen. So just take a moment to grab some paper and pen. You may need to ask someone to share with you. And I invite you to draw a line vertically down the center of your page. In the top right-hand side, write the word future. And in the top left, write the word present. We're going to start on the right-hand side. I want you to imagine a future that is working for everyone and everything, human and non-human species. An economy that's working for everyone and everything. Just imagine that for a moment. And when you've connected with some image, drop down into your body and feel it. How does it feel? in that economy that's working for everyone and everything. Just feel it. And when you've connected to the feeling, draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents how it feels in that economy. A symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents how it feels in that economy. And probably best to open your eyes to do this, so drawing a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents how it feels. Now we're going to move to the left-hand side. How does the present economy feel in your body? And again, when you've connected with that, draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents how the present economy feels. So, I've been doing this experiment for about 10 years all around the world, probably with more than 10,000 people across just about every difference you can imagine: gender, age spectrum, cultural background, religious identity, or secular identity. I've done this with Fortune 500 executives, I've done this with anarchists, I've done this with people living on the streets, through to people living in massive mansions. And it doesn't matter who I do this experiment with, where I do it, or what language I do it in, people consistently draw one of 4 symbols or shapes for the future and one of 4 symbols or shapes for the present, or a close variation or combination of those. So I'm going to reveal to you what people around the world draw, and then we're going to see how that lines up with your experience. Here we go. For the future, people consistently draw a circle, an infinity or panarchy symbol or a wave sign, which is part of that, a spiral, or a heart. Hands up if you drew one of those or a close variation, and just have a look around. Okay. For the present, people typically draw a jagged line, an isosceles triangle, a downward arrow, or a mess of lines. And again, hands up if you drew one of those or a close variation, and have a look around. Okay. What we notice here that relates to this definition of degrowth, and I'm just going to cut to this. Normally we would have a chance to reflect on that experience. Look at that. Look at the difference and also compare it to what you drew. Chances are that you drew something non-linear for the future. And chances are you drew something linear for the present. We live in an economy that is based on linear principles in the macro scale, a capitalist extractive economy. And there's linearity also to forms of communism. The future, however, that we know in our bodies works for everyone and everything has to be based on non-linear principles. And indigenous and other cultures around the world have stewarded that information for a long time, but degrowth for me is moving from here to here. And we all know it no matter what our ideology, body, location, etc.
Thank you so much, Donnie, for that exercise. It truly is like a magician's trick. Haha, I have the card you picked. So, Alemayehu, you shared how witnessing broken relationships and recognizing the need to restore them is your understanding of degrowth, which makes a lot of sense. Having done the exercise we just did, broken relationships could be like a line, restoring them like a circle, and reciprocity being put back into its natural place again. And that is very much what the quote was saying, reciprocity from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and Mary, you explaining how we need to free ourselves from this self-limiting extraction, and in many ways you see degrowth as already happening and inevitable. And then Donnie, thank you for creating that embodied imprint of what we somewhere already know to be true in our bodies about what it means to live in a way that's not harming us and our planet. So this all establishes a shared ground, I hope, because when you study degrowth, it can get very complicated. A lot of very clever people get very angry and puffy about it. Sorry, I shouldn't have said puffy. Oh, God. And that is all there, but this ground that we've just established is where we're going to be engaging with this theme from. So, from this place, let's now dive into our first question. Well, no, that was also never mind. Okay, more substance in this one, I hope. In your work, or in the wider world, where are you encountering possibilities for degrowth or transition? We're slightly using those synonymously here. And maybe if you could give me 2 examples of those possibilities, either in your work or in the wider world that you're witnessing that really inspire you and you feel those sparks, okay, something is really full of potential here. And then I want you to also share with me where you see or encounter in your work challenges for those pathways to unfold and become realized. Shall I let that sink in for a second? And then I'll pick on one of you. Justine, I feel like you've got something formulated that's ready to be spoken. Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you. If you want me to move on to the challenges, just tell me I'm talking for too long because I get a bit overexcited.
Don't worry, I'm keeping my eye on the time and I will interrupt you if I need to.
Thank you. I think the opportunity that I see that's most closely related to my work is this really growing openness that people have to understanding and recognizing the personhood and the intelligence of the more than human world, and beginning to see the possibilities to collaborate with those other beings and with the earth herself. And I think this opportunity is being facilitated from 2 different directions. Firstly, from our growing recognition that indigenous people really have something to teach us at this point. And of course, they have these animist worldviews that feed into that understanding. But also from the huge revolution that's going on in the scientific world, that's telling us very, very clearly that human beings are not the only species that have intelligence or culture or language. And there's very many exciting developments in that area, that we know that plants can learn and remember, we know that whales have culture, we know that slime mold can design a transport system for Tokyo better than a human being can. We know that bats have 15,000 at least different words that they teach their children in a similar way to how we teach our children. And, you know, there is this overwhelming evidence for this going on. And I think, you know, machine learning is likely to come up with a version of Google Translate for animal languages in the next few years. So for me, this speaks of our ability now to engage with this vast array of diverse intelligences that we haven't had access to in the same way before. And that for me, this is what's been missing in our responses to climate and our attempts to transition up until now, that we've been trying to tackle a problem, the roots of which belong to our separation from nature. We've been trying to tackle it in this entirely human way. And to my mind, the next big frontier in terms of bridging divides is how we begin to listen to the voices of the more than human world, you know, alongside the voices of the human beings who've been marginalized that we're still obviously working on. So this is a huge opportunity, and one of the questions that I sit with, as I know others do who are here today, is the question of how we include the voice of all of that in human decision making. And of course, indigenous people have been doing that for very many thousands of years. But there are these new emerging technologies that people are experimenting with here that enable us to do that.
Can you give an example quickly?
Yeah, so for example, the whole rights of nature movement, which is ascribing personhood to nature or to mountains or to rivers, the interspecies councils, which is a more imaginative way of allowing the voice of nature in, but has been trialled in government departments. There's the business of putting nature on your board of directors and having a nature guardian who can hold that perspective when you make strategic decisions. And there's also what they're calling the Internet of Animals, which is this vast and growing body of data on the internet. Some of it is to do with animal languages, some of it is live, that's coming from, you know, wildlife wearables and gives us this idea of where animals are moving, and some of it is bioacoustic data, very many things, all being networked together in a new way that can give us this system for actually living in harmony with the more than human world in a completely different way. So put all of that together, and what I think is there is this very compelling vision that for me has been like this light going on, just really beginning to feel incredibly excited about how the future could be. And that takes away, you know, as Mary was saying earlier, this threat that degrowth is this sacrifice and gives us this alternative, you know, very exciting future to aim for that is just a different way of falling in love with the planet. So I see that as an enormous opportunity. And you also asked about challenges.
Mm-hmm.
I think with the technology, there's obviously a tremendous challenge around ethics because, you know, we won't go into that whole conversation, but that's an obvious one. And I also think there's something about anthropocentrism that is very all-pervasive. And an example of this, you know, I have a friend who was taught, was very blessed to be taught over a number of years by an indigenous teacher who gave her teachings, which she then, you know, had permission to share with others, and so she naturally tried to shape that into a training program that she could offer. And then, because she's very wise, she actually noticed very soon that the act of commodifying what she'd been given actually destroyed the real, or didn't destroy, but it corrupted the purity and the essence of what she'd been given. And so that's like a real dilemma, like how we, you know, have these experiences of something different and then stay true to them when we have to try and embed them within an old and broken system. So I think that's a huge challenge. One more would also be language and just the mind in general. I think going beyond the mind, as we just did there, is a really important thing. And our language keeps us rooted in our conditioning. So the fact that we don't yet have a language for this world that we're reaching for is, I think, you know, a big challenge. I don't know how we solve that, but I kind of feel it all the time that we're reaching for something we can't actually talk about.
Thank you so much. Mary, would you like to go next?
Sure. Things that make me optimistic for the future, you wanted two of those. Starting from the premise, as I do in a lot of my work, that the family is the smallest possible unit of solidarity outside the market. And really, when we talk about degrowth, we talk about finding ways to withdraw from the marketization of everything, the commodification of everything, the reordering of everything to the business of never-ending economic growth. The point at which I began to ask questions about progress was also the point where I had a baby. And I realized that being an autonomous, choosing, negative liberty individual just wasn't the whole story. Because in fact, I welcomed being unfree to the extent that my daughter needed me. And for me, that was a very powerful and literally visceral experience of interdependence that has, she's a wonderful person, and I treasure watching her grow up, but it's also nourished me as an individual and in my writing, ironically, in reflecting on where actually just me on my own stops being a helpful way to think about life and world and community, and becomes a way of being deaf to what the rest of the world has to say. And the sense I discovered in my body, it couldn't really be more embodied. The experience of growing a small person in my literal entrails, it doesn't get more visceral than that, it was such a deep experience of understanding what interdependence was. You know, having always been a sort of pathologically contrarian person, you know, who always wants to take an oppositional stance, always wants to do my own thing, never really enjoyed being on the team. And there I was suddenly, you know, I'm in this situation where my body is telling me that I can't just lie there when she's crying in the middle of the night wanting milk. I can't just lie there and say, no, I don't want to. And I don't want to do that because I love her and she needs me. And it was a very radical, transforming, dizzying discovery. So that's, I suppose, a more embodied way of saying that individualism has limits, and when you find them, you feel them in an embodied way. And for most people, the most immediate of those experiences is family, and the ways we belong to one another in families.
So you're saying the opportunity is to return to honoring that unit of family as the ground where
where I see positive green shoots is, for example, I see young families intentionally leaning out. I see young women who explicitly say, I don't want to be a girl boss. I want to be, I want to do some work, and I also want to be a mum. And why is that frowned on? Why shouldn't I? I want to speak for and to the primacy of care. I see that as a positive thing, particularly among generations who've been educated for decades now, to turn away from that. And secondly, perhaps more controversially, in making an embodied decision to reject that technologization of themselves in the name of individual freedom by rejecting birth control. And this is not necessarily coming from a religious perspective, but for me it has an ecological component in that the contraceptive pill, when I say rejecting birth control, I mean hormones, specifically the pill, which is an ecological catastrophe. And anybody who's looked into the science, it's literally making frogs, destroying frogs, the reproductive systems of aquatic lives. And this is something that is just deeply uncomfortable to talk about if you're both progressive and also interested in ecology. And I see young women who are rejecting that, not even necessarily from a religious perspective, but from a personal, physical integrity perspective. And there I see real green shoots of a desire to come back into an embodied relation with others and with ourselves.
Thank you.
And I have that gives me great hope.
So I have
challenges. So
I have returning to and honoring that unit of the family as an opportunity, and the challenge with the technology. I can't say it.
Technologization.
I still can't say it. I'm running on 2 hours of sleep. Of the bodies. Great. So Donnie, Alemayehu, let's shift to you, and then we'll go to Donnie. What do you see as opportunities as well as challenges in your work and in the wider world when it comes to degrowth and transition?
I begin with the challenge. The challenge is, as a developing nation, the nation, we have a lot of gaps we have to develop. We have to bring growth. That is undeniable. We need to feed our people. We need really basic developments. But the challenge is, are you going to repeat the way the Western have done it? Do we have to develop our agriculture the way the Western have developed their agriculture, using chemicals, all these things? So that is a challenge. How are you going to bring the necessity for the people? So the challenge is policy-wise, practical-wise, we try to copy everything happened in the Western world. That is the biggest challenge. But the opportunity is, I would say, we have still our own organic way of doing things. For instance, if you see the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it has preserved a lot of forest in its own way. Both the genetics, the diversity, all these things. The same wise, we have our own way of organic agriculture. We have a very good community structure, helping each other, sharing resources together. So if we really invest in our own values, fixing our broken relationship in our own way, still there is a possibility to achieve our vision and our own prosperity. But if we try to copy, as we are doing now, then we will be doing the same mistake. We will lose everything. We will lose our values, cultural values, beliefs, even our genetic species, everything. That's really a very scary thing happening now in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Donnie?
In terms of possibilities, a little story. In 2011, person named Christian living in Los Angeles did something unbelievable. They took their money out of Wells Fargo Bank and they moved it over to a credit union, and they put up a post on Facebook saying why they did it. Because Wells Fargo, as a big for-profit bank, was gouging extreme amounts of money for them to just hold an account with less than $100 in the account. What that inspired was unbelievable. $7 billion got transferred over from for-profit banks to not-for-profit credit unions in the US as a direct result of that post on Facebook and what became the Move Your Money campaign. $7 billion, when you move it from one bank to another, isn't just $7 billion because of the way that lending works. If I take $5 or £5 or 5,000 pesos or whatever currency from one account over to another, I'm moving more than just the amount because banks, using fractional reserve systems, are able to lend out more based on the amount that they have in it. Not that that's how it works, but that's what they're able to do. That possibility remains there. We haven't seen a Move Your Money campaign globally or in fact in other countries since then, and I'm puzzled by that. But it's a possibility that sits there, and it's a very powerful possibility if you think about moving from a linear to a non-linear system, because the circulation of money sits at the heart of the circulation of power, and therein the circulation of resources as it relates to our ecology. The second possibility that I'm seeing really emerge in all of my experience globally is a reconnecting with the embodied. Particularly off the back of the upsurge in the global north, the minority world, of mindfulness, which, and people may have different perspectives on this, to me perpetuates somewhat of a disconnect, yet is often presented in this frame of a reconnect. But piggybacking off that, so in other words, that movement I feel has actually led in some beautiful way to people wanting more and seeking more than just a disconnected, like, let me be mindful in my body, to actually a more full sensory experience. And that for me is so interesting. It's so exciting because therein, if we take this idea that our body knows so much about so many things, and to come back to some of the earlier keynotes about memories and remembering and these sorts of pieces, what a beautiful coexisting experience for us to create more spaciousness for that. What a liberating possibility that brings in if we create spaces where we can be more embodied, because then the magic can really come out in some amazing ways. The challenges I'm seeing, one in particular, is that my colleagues and friends, and I'm not seeking to throw shade on them here, but to speak something into the space that doesn't get spoken too often, that folks who are using language of degrowth, post-growth, donut economics, etc., two things. One, some people aren't yet ready to accept that there is no sustainable form of capitalism, period. And until we get to there, the conversations are pretty restricted in terms of what's possible. You can't go into the what does a post-capitalist market economy look like until you've come to an understanding of there's no... You can put any word in front of capitalism and it doesn't change the fact that it's going to be extractive and there's a growth imperative with respect to the money supply, ... The second part of this is my colleagues, friends, comrades in lots of these conversations are often white, male, academic, or white, female, or non-binary, academic, and they're not yet ready to take on their own white fragility. And so when I see beautiful possibilities with respect to voices from the Global South, especially Black, Indigenous, people of color perspectives, people identifying as female, bringing through their lived experience and wisdom, the fragility is still there, the patronization is still there, the performativity is still there, and the spaciousness is not there to go through the painful decolonizing process that never ends, of recognizing that you're in that position, in that body, and you need to create space.
Thank you, Donnie. Okay, so from Justine, we have the opportunity of listening to the more than human world to design infrastructure and lifeways, right? You've listed a litany of organizations and studies, and you definitely sound like a scientist there for a minute. And the challenges are the anthropocentrism and the language barriers. Mary said that returning to the unit of the family as a ground from where lifeways that are conducive to degrowth can generate is an opportunity, and well, no, I wrote down the technologization of the bodies as the challenge. I said it. But we can definitely come back to when you can express more there. And Alemayehu, you said that the basic developments that still need to take place in Ethiopia are a huge challenge in promoting degrowth policies, and the opportunities lie in fixing our broken relationships, which I know from a previous conversation you mean the broken relationships between humans and nature, humans to humans, and between the sacred and humans as well. And Donnie, we just heard yours, so I was just going over that to refresh your memory and have all of those opportunities and challenges quite clearly before us. So my next question is, how would you respond to the challenge another has posited through the lens of how you understand spiritual ecology? What solution would you bring to it? This could get interesting, fascinating, juicy. A lot could happen. Because there are vast differences in how you imagine those challenges, even if there's a shared understanding of what transition is. So, Justine, how would you respond to the challenge that Alemayehu shared? Oh no, you want to respond to another one? Go ahead.
That was a lot of challenges to keep in your head at one point and formulate an answer to, but I mean, I think they're all really interesting.
I can repeat Donnie's again. Do I need to, or I just assume that was quite fresh? Yeah, no, it's fine.
So Donnie's challenge about decolonization, I think, is a really interesting one from the perspective of kinship, because we, in our work, are focusing, very much on the opportunity that I described earlier about how to include the voice of more than humans, whilst also knowing that we can't be kin to the more than human world whilst we are still so poor at being kin to, marginalized human identities within the world. So I think how one of the ways that we respond to it is really by recognizing that this process of understanding into being somewhere lies beneath all of that challenge. So if we can really deeply internalize that the reality of interbeing, that we cannot, for example, as humans, we cannot survive or thrive separate from the wider web of life. Like if the bees die, we die, right? And that interbeing can be felt in the body, the way you were talking about embodied work. And I just feel that actually interbeing is you talked about really the embodied experience of interbeing through being a mother. And I feel actually it's the embodied, lived, deeper experience of interbeing that actually comes into the challenge that you're talking about, that we recognize that, we can't survive without the intelligences of every human and the intelligences of every non-human together. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you. Donnie, would you like to respond to somebody else's through the lens of spiritual ecology, what solutions you would bring to it?
I should add that these are all new questions for us panelists. We weren't aware of this, so...
I warned you that there may be spontaneity.
Yes. I'm going to go for it. This is going to up things a little. So, I'm with a dilemma right now in my body. There's something that is uncertain that I'm sensing into that might be interesting to be shared, and yet I'm sitting with the very thing that I just raised about white supremacy culture. So, for example, my esteemed colleague here said something about the challenges that doesn't quite sit with me comfortably, but I'm in a white body here, and this is my friend in a different body, and so I'm going to lean in with my heart and say, I'm going to share something publicly here that is just my sharing, right? Not seeking to diminish, or in fact, perhaps as we may see, there may be some common ground even, or maybe not. So for me, this question of growth, global north, global south, comes up a lot in these conversations, right? And because of the very thing that I said before about how a lot of white academics are driving conversations around degrowth, post-growth, etc., using language that can often co-opt things that have existed for long periods of times and say, this is the language we're going to use, and I've done this myself. I have a sensitivity to, therefore, someone like myself talking about what should happen anywhere. And so I want to just flag, I'm not seeking to say what should happen. I'm wanting to draw in from this spiritual ecology perspective what my body senses is the connecting piece in terms of that question of like, what happens across places that have had historic extraction, etc., in regards to these conversations? Because I don't think it's as easy as global north grows and there's spaciousness for growth in the global south. To me, there has to be the exploration of capitalism. And if the growth in any country in the global south, I live in Argentina, if the growth in Argentina post inflation, recession, etc., the struggles that are there right now, is based on a system of capitalism, which by its very nature is extractive, there's no sustainable future there for Argentina. Because there's no periphery, in academic language, where are you going to extract from if you're growing in the global south? Right? The setup, the dynamics of growth have been predicated through a capitalist lens and a colonialist lens on extraction of the global south. So perhaps, and maybe we'd agree on this, the growth and development that I would be, that feels right in my body is along the lines of asset-based community development, where you start with what's working, you're building that out. You're building dependencies within that take you away from the dependencies externally. We start back with the remutualizations of business. We recognize that, for example, Kenya, the strong cooperative banking sectors there, and we build on those kinds of things. We recognize that so many of the answers to our future lie in countries of the global south and communities that have stewarded ways of staying in connection with the circular, with the nonlinear. But I would say we have to interrogate that question of growth in the global south from the question of, are you saying capitalist growth or a different form that's post-capitalist?
Thanks, Donnie. There's something I just very quickly want to clarify. So you listed the challenges, Alemayehu, but I'm also aware that many models of degrowth actually don't expect global south countries to try and follow those policies. They exempt them from their models, and instead they say that there are many communities who are exemplary and we should follow their example, and I really believe that yours is one of them. Would you briefly just share with the audience what your work, day-to-day work, looks like with the forest that you've stewarded for decades and the local community you work with? And in many ways, the principles with which you live, they are at the heart of spiritual ecology. They are at the heart of what can foster degrowth as well. So just share that, and then we'll come back to trying to do some sense-making around the challenges we discussed.
Okay, thank you. As I said, our principle is to have our own organic way of growth. And as an exemplary, let's see the Ethiopian Orthodox Church conservation tradition. So the church is one of the oldest institutions in Ethiopia. And while the whole forest resources have been destroyed the last 100 years, the church were able to maintain some of it surrounding its church, you know. So every church has its own forest. It could be half hectare or it could be several hundred hectare. And when we count, it's like 32,000 of them. So now we say, when we say forest development, natural resource development, we say, wait a minute, we have the blueprints, we have the pieces. So we can reconnect them. We can use the values, I mean, the church has among its followers. And based on that, really, we are doing a great job. And this, the 32,000 area means the Ethiopian Northern Highland, where the Blue Nile water, much of it originates, you know. You know, Blue Nile contributes 80% to Nile. So what I was saying is still we have local capabilities. Still we have local blueprints. Without adopting, without taking everything from West, we have the possibility of you know, developing our agriculture, developing our economy, and also the social artifacts, you know. So my organization, ORDA, have been working the last, I would say, 20 years specifically in using these traditional values and improving livelihood of many, and also environmental rehabilitation. So I would say with our own way, still, you know, economic prosperity is possible without the greed, without the colonial mentality, without the capitalism principles, values. There are ways. The only thing is looking to our own capability, beliefs, cultures, and other norms. So I see hope now with that. I see hope. I see fixing those, you know, broken relationships, and then bringing better livelihood by including, with inclusive principle. I mean, we have a lot of tribes, we have a lot of groups, so inclusivity is also an issue. And with that, I see the possibility, and I see a bright future by taking our own capabilities.
Thank you, Alemayehu. Mary?
I'd love to respond to Justine. Just a few reflections on your work on kinship with other creatures, other species, and other. Again, starting. Well, okay. I'll start from the family again. One of my impossible to substantiate theories is that one of the reasons why women have stopped wanting to have kids, which is just true pretty much across the world, with very few exceptions, is because of how far you have to travel mentally from the mind space you need to be in to function in modernity to being able to meet a baby on their own terms. It's an impossible distance, and it's incredibly difficult to do. It's painful to come back from meeting a baby where they are to functioning in the modern world. It's an absolutely unfathomable chasm. And really, I wanted to start there again, because what you talk about when you talk about, you know, re-engaging with other species in the fullness of their being, is very much the same spirit as encountering a baby in the fullness of their being, because they're part of your body in a sense, but they're also radically other, and they don't think, you can't reason with them. You just have to, but you just have to meet them where they are and try and meet their needs. And that's very much the spirit with which we might be encountering the world more broadly. And I suppose, and again, the gulf between that and the extractive mindset, which it's come up repeatedly, because of course that's really what we're all grappling with. is as unbridgeable as the Gulf, even more perhaps than trying to toggle between being a functioning, high-powered, effective, whatever, and meeting a baby where they are. It's the same gap. It's the gap between seeing the world as in terms of what it can give you as a set of resources, in framing, as Heidegger would call it, or versus meeting the world in its fullness. I mean, I keep chickens in the back garden. It's a very sort of middle-class home counties thing to do. I love observing them. Chickens just have they're great. I recommend everybody keeps chickens. But watching a chicken in the fullness of their chickenness, you know, they're pretty basic. You know, they're just interested in bugs and salad, and that's pretty much it, and not dying. But you observe a chicken in their natural habitat, and it's obvious when they're fulfilling their nature. They scratch and they peck, and it's joyful to watch them, you know. And you can just experience the nature of a chicken just by observing them. And then I think about the difference between that and treating a chicken as a unit of production in an industrial farming. And really, that to me is a powerful illustration of the difference between the extractive relation and what I think of as the basic disposition of my understanding of spiritual ecology, which is to try and perceive things in terms of their own nature and to meet whatever it is that you're encountering to the best of your ability in the fullness of its nature, where it is, and to try and form a relationship, even across species. And I suppose I offer this as a personal gloss or as an interpretation, and perhaps a contribution to trying to make some steps in the direction of finding new kinds of kinship. Even arguably we could start with each other before we get to other species. But it's fundamentally the same challenge, to stop seeing one another as human resources, or as units of production in a factory farm, or as, you know, however many tons of firewood or however many tons of coal, and to see the world in its interrelatedness and in the fullness of its being.
Thank you so much, Mary. Okay, so in about 2 minutes, I'm supposed to open the floor for questions, but I'm not going to wait 2 minutes, and it's too dangerous to ask another question, because then that would be 15 minutes gone, and then you wouldn't have the time you deserve. So, by the way, I only switched up the last question a bit. The first 3 were the same, okay? And I was just suddenly very curious. You know, you all shared where you see the opportunities. You all shared where you see the challenges. And then it was interesting to watch how you tried to problem solve the other person's challenge through your understanding is so intellectual, but through your sort of lived experience of what you experience to be spiritual ecology, right? And now I want to hand it over to you, and no pressure, but I want you to do some legwork here. You know, you've sort of heard everything they've said, and I really would love for us to have as much of a grasp as we can on these themes and play around with them before we leave here today. So what are the questions you have for these 4 wonderful panelists? Where are you seeing blind spots? Where are you seeing wisdom? Where do you want to ask questions? What in all of this applies to your work? Many of your applications that I read, you know, you're involved in the world of transition, or you are facilitators or teachers, educators, etc. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to harvest questions. So I'm going to take, I don't know, 3 at a time. Is that too many? I don't. It's three at a time. Yeah, three. Okay, let's go.
Hi, thanks to the panel. I'll try and keep the question short. I was just reflecting as I was listening to you on an agroforestry project I came across in Brazil, which I found really inspiring. And actually, when Donnie invited us at the beginning to think about what a thriving world of the future would look like, that's where my mind went to, and I actually drew a butterfly. I didn't draw a circle. And one of the things that I took away from that project was a very clear delineation that they made between the current system being input-based, like, you know, the normal form of agriculture is just like we stick more chemicals in, or, you know, we just stick more inputs in, whereas their focus was on being process-based. And it just seemed to make so much sense to me, and I was like, why isn't this the common form of agriculture that's practiced? So any reflections on input-based versus process-based? And then, again, going back to that project in Brazil, it was based on degraded land, which had been, all of the life had been sucked out of it by the monoculture that had been there before. And through their nurturing of the soil, it had come back to life and was this haven for other species as well as humans. And so perhaps we need to frame degrowth as regrowth. That's what came to mind, because actually what they were doing was enabling regrowth of species and people on that land.
Thank you. Question number 2. Here on the left.
Thank you. It occurs to me that there's an election happening in this country in a few days' time, and that one of the things that has characterized the past 14 years, if you read much of the mainstream discourse, is low growth. And there was a very good article by William Davies a couple of years ago in the London Review of Books that focused on this and on there being a kind of declinism that suited certain rentier interests that was connected with the low growth in the British economy over the past 14 years. And on the other hand, we have a likely new government who are, if Blair was education, 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 Starmer and Reeves are growth, growth, growth. Is there anywhere worth even trying to insert ourselves within the conversation of mainstream politics in a country like the UK today with the things that you've been talking about? Or do we just need to get on being the rats running around under the feet of the dinosaurs, waiting for the dinosaurs to go extinct?
Yeah. And the third one, oh gosh, this is difficult. There's no favorites here. I don't know, this lady, that lady, okay.
First of all, thank you all so much. So I know, Donnie, you mentioned the Move Your Money campaign and how that really had an impact on where people were putting their money. And I'm curious what other suggestions you might have for consumers to have an impact in what brands they are supporting, and opportunities for people to have an impact as individual consumers and what that looks like.
Okay, thank you. Shall we start with the third one? Seems maybe easier to answer than the other two.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, you go.
third
If you
one
answered
there.
that one, Donnie.
I love that question because I was dreaming on the way here of getting it. So thank you. Because in so many activist spaces, there is an understandable counter-response to the idea of individual action being a thing that capitalism enforces on us, neoliberalism pushes on us this idea of individualization, right, which it does. However, then all of the individual action gets thrown out, and the thread that I would recommend is individual actions that have an effect on systems are quite different to changing your light bulb. So the systemic actions I would recommend are move your money, move your investments if you have any, move your labor over to not-for-profit forms of business, or at minimum social enterprise, if possible, if you're in the labor market. Move your activism over to supporting not-for-profit organizations that have business activities, right, moving into the market. And this is a bigger one, move your gaze to the distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit business, so that when you're consuming, you ask questions about whether or not the financial model underneath what you're purchasing is actually by its very nature more circulatory with the money that you're spending, or extractive and accumulatory.
I'm sorry, that comment was supposed to be ironic earlier. It didn't land. Apologies. I would love to put the dinosaur question to you, Justine. Shall we wait for the dinosaurs to die out?
Sure. I think it's a really good question. And I think, I don't know what, this is a very personal response to it, but I guess I feel there are two things that we need to be doing. The first is creating these alternative realities that are not impacted by mainstream politics. So what I would call sanctuaries for life, often, land-based projects which are rooted in a new version of reality that have all sorts of different kinds of resilience built in, the community resilience and the resilience by being connected up to the wider web of life. So these alternative ways of being, these seed pods for a future generation, we really need to be putting a lot of energy into those. And then I think we wait for those structures to, if not to fall, to loosen a little bit, which they will do under the pressure of what's coming. And then these sanctuaries for life, these little islands, will be very much needed. And hopefully there will be some more space in the collective for, the ideas that we're housing in those seed places to actually take root in the collective. And if you'd have asked me a few years ago, I would have thought just wait for the whole thing to fall. We just have to be resilient in those islands, and we have to just let the rest of that mainstream world fall the way it's going to fall. But actually now I feel much more hopeful. I feel like there will be space. When it begins to wobble, there will be space, and they will be looking to us for the solutions to those, to bring those things in. And I think there will be change in the collective at a certain point. So I'm a lot more hopeful about that now than I was 5 years ago. But it's a brilliant question, and I'd love to know what other people's perspectives are on that.
Thank you so much, Justine. Okay, sure, we'll hear briefly the perspectives on this, and then we still need to answer the regrowth, degrowth question, which has been covered a lot in degrowth literature, and this debate goes back decades, right, Donnie? Okay, so if you share your reflections on this, and we'll come back to that.
On whether or not we should
wait for the dinosaurs to die, and the mainstream politics question from Dougal, yeah.
I mean, I'm very much in favour of building in parallel, in whatever form that takes. I'm reading a book at the moment on what happened after the Bronze Age collapse in 1177 BC. Which is it's a hopeful book, and it's all sort of archaeology, so nobody's quite sure what happened, but it's a hopeful book in the sense that it sketches what happened after a hugely complex civilization that ran all the way through the along the coast of Europe up to the Levant. It was a hugely complex multi-civilizational international network, and it collapsed, and nobody's completely sure why. But afterwards, it's not as though it was just chaos and tumbleweed. Civilizations persisted. They were just smaller, and they were more local. And yes, there were more wars, and yes, there was chaos, and there was some chaos. But life really did go on. And I think that's something to hold on to. Dougal and I, the asker of that question, have been talking about collapse for 20 years now. And I suppose it's worth bearing in mind that it hasn't happened yet, Dougal. I think we're off on the timeline, even if I think we're still broadly right in the analysis. And I still think what we've always, I still believe what we've long held, which is that we need to be thinking ahead, and we need to be building in parallel. And that probably means building smaller and less complex, and anticipating the internationalism of the current world gradually falling away.
Thank you, Mary. Alemayehu, would you like to share your reflection?
I rather reflect on the agroforestry question. The third question.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, taking the concept of degrowth in a nutshell would cause the same kind of problem. I mean, there is a degraded landscape, and you have to promote agroforestry in that area. So in this sense, this is an organic growth, and in any way this cannot be undermined. So as I said, when you say degrowth, we have to be careful, and where it should apply and what does it mean. So for your project, I mean, it's an organic growth. I think you better keep it up.
Let's take 3 more questions, or did you want to comment on the language real quick?
Yeah, very quickly on the language, and it's difficult to do it quickly. The history of the colonial and neo-colonial world and the capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist system is to take language and co-opt. The idea behind a lot of degrowth languaging was to try to set a marker where that co-option was going to be very difficult. Maybe not impossible, but very difficult. The second that you rename something regrowth is the moment that you will have the big for-profit multinationals as part of their corporate social responsibility doing regrowth. It's a little harder for them to co-opt degrowth, right? So that's some of the explanation. But when we set up 14 years ago as the Post-Growth Institute, we thought about this very carefully in the framing. And so that's where we thought and felt we're going to play a different language here, building out of some of the other pieces that were emerging. And so the language and the framing is critical, but also in a strange way, degrowth, even if degrowth doesn't become a directional aspect of mainstream market economies worldwide, the Overton window, right, that window in which change happens, you need
just
groups.
Explain what the Overton window is for those who may not know what an Overton window is?
Sure, and I don't even know myself very well. But my understanding is it's that window of political possibility that describes where the appetite of possibilities can land. And so if you don't have language that is strong and hard, and we see this throughout all sorts of social change movements, there's roles for all parts of the spectrum because they create possibilities of spaciousness within. So I might not use the language of degrowth so much as I use as post-growth, but I appreciate how hard working so many people are because it opens up for me to appear a little bit more moderate about something, even though I'm as much, if not more, radical in reality.
Thank you. 3 more questions. Nadine, just pick, because that takes the pressure off me.
One question which never comes up in discussions of degrowth is what's going to happen to healthcare. Healthcare in some countries already takes 20% of GDP, and therefore that expenditure will have to decrease. If you look at a typical Western country, something like 50% of the money spent on a person in their lifetime for healthcare is spent in the last year of life, meaning that the main occupation of health services is to keep people alive for a few months after they get their inevitably fatal disease. And it seems to me that there's going to have to be a real discussion everywhere about what is the purpose of medicine, because at the moment it's unsustainable. It's probably the biggest producer of plastic waste in the earth, because we've gone away from reusing glass instruments to throw away plastic for everything. And it's also producing probably around 8% of global CO2 emissions. So how are we going to have the debate about where healthcare should be going?
Thank you.
On the topic of capitalism and development in the global south, I was wondering if you could speak to how a global redistribution of wealth as part of a reparations could address that, and to what extent you think that's possible.
Thank you. Actually, Nadine, for the third one, could we go here to Renee? Sorry. Thanks.
Sorry. My question was around the intelligence of a more than human world. So much focus has been on AI recently, artificial intelligence, and I'm wondering what the natural intelligence paradigm could be for us to lean into. Justine.
Yeah, I was going to say, can I pick a person for each of these questions? Just because I'm looking at the time too. So maybe Mary, if you answer the healthcare question, Justine, the intelligence of the more than human world, and Alemayehu and Donnie comment on the reparations question. Shall we start with the healthcare, Mary?
Sure. There are no good scenarios, basically. Well, all of them have some, all scenarios, I think, here have some externalities. You know, when you asked the question, I was thinking, well, Ivan Illich has entered the chat. I mean, the Illichian critique, I don't know if any of you are familiar with his book, Medical Nemesis, but in it he argues that there's a point beyond which the elaboration of healthcare services becomes actively crippling. It has a counterproductive effect in that it makes people weaker and less resilient and less able to cope with the reality of our inevitable frailty and eventual death. And I think actually this is illustrated in the growing calls for legal euthanasia in this country, which I think are driven in part by the fact that we're so good now at alleviating physical illness that the reality of death has come to seem an intolerable affront, such that the only way of bringing that back within our control is to demand the right to choose the time of our death. So that's, to be clear, I think embracing legal euthanasia is a slippery slope that we should not choose. And I think we only need to look at what's happening in Canada to see how that can mesh with a certain actuarial, a certain bean counting attitude towards the welfare state, to see truly horrifying possibilities already at work in terms of what's happening to healthcare, where bluntly, where a patient in Canada is perceived as too expensive or too difficult to help, they're now simply being offered the opportunity to kill themselves with a thumbs up from the Canadian welfare state. And that's not a world I want to live in. That's not a country I want to live in. But there are calls for it, again, on the basis of individual dignity. I mean, against this, I really don't see any obvious solution to the fact that the current healthcare system is a rising cost and effectively has become a Ponzi scheme, where a shrinking body of taxpayers is funding a growing body of aging retirees to embrace ever more costly medical treatments. I don't see a good solution. I see a point where the wheels come off. Sorry, that's a really mixed metaphor. I don't think there is what can happen to healthcare, except that eventually, probably not that far into the future, universal healthcare just stops being a thing. I don't love that possibility, but I don't see any way around it.
Thank you. Justine, would you like to respond to Renee's question?
Sure, yeah. I'm not entirely sure what your question is about paradigm, but I'll chuck a few thoughts at you and then maybe you can say if I'm going in the right direction and clarify after I've thrown out a few thoughts. But thank you for the question. Just to say firstly on AI that, I think artificial intelligence is opening up some incredible opportunities in terms of how we understand the more than human world. And there's so much going on in that area that personally I find incredibly exciting. But obviously it comes with these enormous ethical challenges. And just to give a little example, I don't know if people are aware that human beings already manufactured robot bees that can be put into a hive and that can interpret the communications of bees and pass them to humans and also pass our messages to the bees via these robots. And obviously that has the potential to serve life, or it has the potential to be really misused, and that's true of a lot of these new innovations that are coming. When it comes to the natural intelligence, there's all of the nature-based solutions and the biomimicry that provides all sorts of really exciting ways that we can respond to things, such as fungi dealing with pollution, or reed beds teaching us how to create great salination, desalinating plants. Or I love the example that we might have shared with you at an earlier point, where the goats on Mount Etna, the volcano in Italy, are an early warning system for human beings because they react, they can sense when the volcano is erupting before human beings can, and so we can follow their leadership when it comes to knowing when the volcanoes are going to erupt. And there's all sorts of very interesting stuff that we can learn from the more than human world about democracy and about leadership. So for example, pigeons are my current model of how to do leadership, because well, I won't go into the details of that one, but they lead from within the flock. So the pigeon that's actually leading the flock is leading from the middle. And often they anyway, I won't go into the details of that one, but there's lots and lots of examples of natural intelligence that we can learn from. And what I find really interesting is where those two things come together. And, you know, it's very risky territory, like the whole of AI is very risky territory. But there could be, I mean, can we conceive of an AI that's plugged into, you know, the wider web of life, but is in service to that web? Like, can we create an AI that is in service to life, as well as having at its disposal all of this data on both humans and more than humans? So, you know, I'm fascinated by this area, and of course there is just this huge risk that AI will leave us more separated, you know, from the beauty and wonder and awe of creation, you know, or it can lead us deeper into that. So I've got a whole load of thoughts over it, but maybe you could just clarify what you meant by, you know, the natural intelligence paradigm.
I would say the contrast between consumption and appreciation, maybe. That's not necessarily a helpful dichotomy, but it's, as you said, in service of intelligence that is in service of, or intelligence that is for the purpose of consumption.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think it's about us, you know, learning from the natural world how, you know, how to be in service to life. Like, they are our teachers in that respect. But I do think there's the possibility for them to come together. So I can't really answer your question, but I do think there is potential for actually those things to come together in a way that does serve life.
Thank you, Justine. And Alemayehu and Donnie, if you respond to the reparations question, and then we'll begin to sort of draw to a close.
I really didn't get the question, so maybe Donnie would...
Donnie, do you want to go first, and then Alemayehu can go second?
As an activist, I'm obviously passionate about reparations, and with respect to things that often get put forward, how many people here remember the 2000 Global Debt Jubilee? Right. When you have an extractive system and you seek to set up things like jubilees, etc., if they land, and this is the same for universal basic income, some of you may be familiar with this, these kinds of redistributory mechanisms, and in fact the same can be said for progressive taxation, not that I'm saying I don't support it as a concept, when they are placed in a capitalist system, what happens is that they just hide the extraction better. And in fact, politically, that's what we've seen in the global north around the world is right free market activity accelerates extraction and accumulation more apparently, and the leftist perspectives just hide the extraction better. That's the bind, because we don't have a realistic, practical market alternative beyond capitalism articulated and received in people's bodies in ways they know, what can I do to advance it? So if you, for example, say, we're going to do massive debt relief as a result of through a reparative lens, for example. That generally doesn't work. Why? Because if I am at a for-profit bank and you have a debt to me, I am not going to participate in wiping your debt. If a government wants to, and this is what often happens, pay off that debt, the media is going to read that as, debts got paid off, amazing. Guess what happened? That debt getting paid off meant that the money went from the government over to me in the private company, and we saw more accumulation happen in that system. So the gateway to reparations, and I'm going to say something here that I've not heard anyone say anywhere, is to push for a post-capitalist market economy, while also seeing how can I, as an individual, in my organizations, etc., seek to be reparative by understanding white supremacy culture in all its facets, not just monetarily or land-based, but how am I extractive? And in that sense, I'll stop extracting time.
Thank you so much. And by the way, we're like so on time with everything throughout the course. Yeah, so we're doing great. Alemayehu, would you like to comment, or you're okay? Okay, so this has been very interesting. When you shared your different conceptions of challenges and opportunities. There were contradictions between what you considered to be challenges, and there were differences in how, for instance, you used the word embodiment, Mary, and how in the context and the way that you were using it, Donnie. And then when you were asked to try to problem solve the challenges of the other, you picked the challenge that didn't have contradictions with the opportunities that you listed. So it's just an interesting observation to make. And then the audience, every single question that the audience asked was positing a problem to the panelists. And it's not very common, you know, generally during panel discussions. Some of the questions are not questions, they're sort of really challenging something that was said, and that's the energy that's coming forward, and fair enough, and there's room for that, and it's part of the natural process. But again, something interesting to notice that maybe, I don't know, maybe you just did such an amazing job of instilling those principles, Claire, like we can sit with all the different viewpoints and be with it, and every single question was about just trying to find a pathway forward in a very specific context in our world. So those are all fascinating observations to make, I think, and I really, really hope that this panel discussion was useful to you, that if the themes of degrowth and spiritual ecology were new to you, there were plenty of handholds in this exploration together. You saw how these worlds are conceived and experienced through the brilliant minds of four very different and very committed individuals in their own fields and in their devotion to their work. So thank you so much for joining us on this exploration together. I hope it will be useful for a while to come.